David Brewster here, New Brewster's Millions of Rants, and this is Passing the Torch. And this lesson is going to basically focus on an area of learning about music and the guitar that's very interesting and inspiring, but it's also very frustrating and confusing. And that is being original and finding, licks and phrases and guitar solos and chords and chord progressions and techniques and all sorts of stuff from other players. And then basically adapting or borrowing those ideas and bringing them over to your musical world. So we're not really talking about stealing from other musicians. We're talking about borrowing. Passing the torch is kind of the term that people have used for a long time. Artists and musicians, for decades and centuries have done this. But it does seem like a lot of people in the modern age are kind of afraid to borrow, music or ideas from other players or other songs or bands or whatever. But that's what this lesson is going to talk about, just kind of freeing yourself and learning something, and then learning how to be playful and creative with it and change it into something else. So here we go. And to make sure that everybody's head is in the right place as far as where we're starting here, here's an image with a dozen, pioneers of the guitar that literally lit those torches that they passed to future generations. And when you look at this list, you're going to notice like Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen aren't mentioned, because this is before Jimi Hendrix. This is, guitarists from the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, or even before that. And they literally, kind of shape some of the licks and phrases and some of the techniques that guitarists still use and explore today. So to help us get started and actually move into some musical examples and start playing, here's an image with 4 of the most common chord progressions you'll find in music, and that's true for blues, rock, folk, country, jazz, classical. There's tons of music hiding in these 4 chord progressions. To get started here, I'm actually picking the key of G, and there's a reason why I picked G, but I'm going to cycle through those 4 progressions in the key of G just to kind of flesh out some different variations or ideas here. So you could definitely use like basic bar chords or open position chords, but I'm going to stay away from that just to mix things up and kind of push things forward. But think of that first progression of 1, 4, 5, and G. That'd be G major, C major, D major, and then we could return to the 1 right there with that 70s inversion for another G. So there's G, C, D, and G. Technically G over B right there. But you get the idea. Like the 2-5-1's very common in jazz. You could approach that like an A minor 7 for the 2. You could do a D9 for the 5 chord. And then G major 7 for the 1. Very jazzy kind of sound. 1, 6, 2, 5, you could do, G major. The 6th is E minor. 2 is A minor. And then the 5 is D major. Like that. 1, 6, 2, 5. And we can keep going. The next progression here we could do like this. There's a 1, 5, 6, 4. And that's G major, D major, E minor, and C major. Now keep in mind there are, hundreds of different ways we could put those chords on the guitar neck, maybe thousands of different ways, just arranging the notes and the chords in different ways, finding different voicings, changing the rhythm or the tempo of whatever you're playing. So right there you can start mixing that up and come up with all sorts of different versions and variations of those chords. So as far as mixing those progressions up and, changing things, you might be stumped, kind of wondering like, well, how do I do that? And it's actually easier than you might think. So let's just take one of those progressions. Let's pick the most common progression you'll find on the guitar, and that's basically a 1, 4, 5. So in the key of G, that's going to be G, D, and C. And there are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of songs that revolve around those 3 chords. So if you keep that progression in mind and then think of all the different variations and versions of that progression that you've seen on the guitar, there's tons of music out there that revolves around G, C, and D on the guitar. ways of putting those chords together, and it's up to you. Just use your imagination and start moving around and just see what happens whenever you take a chord and move it somewhere else, or pair it with another chord. Change up the rhythm, maybe do some muted strumming or something like that. And the next thing you know, you're creating something different or something new. So before we continue here, I want you to think about a very famous quote that came from a very famous artist. And the quote is, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal." And that came from Pablo Picasso. And even though there's a lot of people online that are arguing whether he actually said that or not, a lot of professional fingers point to Picasso as far as the origin of that quote. And I want you to think about that. Good artists borrow, great artists steal. I know what some of you might be thinking. Well, yeah, if I'm going to steal these ideas from other songwriters, then I'm going to get sued, right? And especially in recent years, all these lawsuits surrounding people like Joe Satriani versus Coldplay, and Tom Petty versus Sam Smith, and of course Spirit versus Led Zeppelin. There's been a lot of controversy as far as, copyright and, chord progressions, song structures, and stuff like that. And here's an image with some famous lawsuits and court appearances surrounding, copyright violations, songwriting, and all that. So here's a very famous example of what I'm talking about. We're going to take a look at the chord progression from Pachelbel's famous Canon in D, which you can definitely find it in that song. And that piece has been, performed at millions of weddings, and it appears in commercials and TV shows and all sorts of stuff. Very famous composition. But then the chord progression has been borrowed and lifted from literally hundreds, if not thousands, of other musicians, since that time. And the piece is hundreds of years old. So you can definitely go back and study a lot of classical music. You can borrow chord progressions, licks, phrases, and melodies, and all sorts of stuff from classical composers, because all those composers died, at least most of them died hundreds of years ago. And there's no copyright, on that material. So you can take Pachelbel's Canon and call it, whatever you want. Paul Gilbert literally turned it into Taco Bell's Canon, so you can do a lot with this. But Pachelbel's Canon is basically D, A, B minor, F sharp minor, G to D, G to A. Very common progression. Ring a bell, like you might be thinking of something other than Pachelbel's Canon. But here's an image with a bunch of songs that borrow either the complete chord progression, parts of that chord progression, or maybe they modified it, they changed keys, maybe they, changed one of the chords, or they moved to a different chord. But here's a lot of songs that borrow some of their ideas from Pachelbel's Canon in D. And as far as what Paul Gilbert did to turn Pachelbel's Canon into Taco Bell's Canon, he literally just took the chord progression and then turned the chords into string-skipped arpeggios, which is one of his specialties. So if you take that chord progression and play D major right here, that matches the first chord D, and then he answered that with A major, and then B minor right here, and then F sharp minor, and then G major to D major, and then repeat that G major, and then A major. And the same progression. But string skip like that. Very simple idea, but that's really cool to hear guitarists do that. Take something that you might hear in a classical, situation or a symphonic orchestra, and then you hear it played on electric guitar, maybe with distortion or some effects. Really cool. So that's an example of noticing something in classical music and then noticing the variations and mutations after that in, pop and rock and metal and other styles of music. So that's classical. But let's do this again, but now we're going to focus on jazz. And there's a certain lick in jazz music that appears in thousands and thousands of live recordings and studio recordings. and it's known as the lick. And there's a video circulating around online that's really interesting, and I actually made a copy of it so you can see it. So it's about 1.5 minutes long, or 1:20. But here's a video showing this jazz lick in action in different musicians, different keys, different instruments. Sometimes it's horns or guitar or piano or violin or whatever. But check this out. Now I want to show you the lick, and I want to start playing with it, making some variations here. So I'm going to put this in the key of D or D minor, and you could think of this played over a D minor 7, and you can play it right here. Moving from that A to D, and then this E, F, G, go back to that E, and then end on C to D. Once again, played over D minor 7. And it's really rare for me to include transcriptions, but here's a transcription or a tab featuring that lick so you can learn it. Now right there, you can make variations of this really easy. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to slide into that last note instead of, fretting them separate like this. And I played everything else the same, but I slid into the last note. Now let's modify the entire phrase. Instead of doing it this way, let's do this. It's the same lick, but I totally rearranged the fingering there, because now we're doing this instead of. So it's going to feel very different like that. And right there I slid at the end, just like we did in the previous variation. But maybe we could do it like this. And right there you can grab that C and slide along the D string instead of going back on the G right there. And you can keep going. We could slide more down here. And then right there, we could do something like that. Really different, like that. And there I'm almost kind of stretched out. Well, I'm not almost, I am stretched out right there. But then I bent C to D at the end. And you could tap the last note, you can bend, you can do all sorts of stuff. But just think of different ways of playing that very simple phrase. Kind of creating more variations of one musical idea. So let's move this in a rock direction, and definitely one of the most commonly borrowed or stolen rock licks ever is the Chuck Berry lick. And he influenced everybody. Everybody's played versions of this. Hendrix, Van Halen, Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Ace Frehley, I mean, you name it, everybody has played this. But, different versions and variations of these licks. That kind of stuff. And there's a lot happening right there. There's lots of Chuck Berry licks. There's more than just one Chuck Berry lick. But I guess really the lick I'm thinking about is the Duckwalk lick, this thing. Because that one lick or idea spawned millions of variations. So right there it's just two notes, you know, a bent E flat to that F. But then you start thinking about a double stop right there. Right? Then you start thinking about separating those notes. Or maybe, you know, adding a different note. And then the next thing you know, you have like the Freebird lick. There's tons of variations and different versions of that one phrase, which really, all fingers kind of point back to Chuck Berry. You know, creating all those different variations and mutations of that one idea. What about another famous rock lick? How about the Randy Rhoads lick? You can find this in Crazy Train and Flying High Again, a whole bunch of Ozzy songs that feature Randy Rhoads. But this thing, and there's tons of variations of this too, but one more time. And it brings out the strong Aeolian flavor, and you're definitely kind of borrowing part of the Chuck Berry lick right here. And then you're going to pull off right there that E to C sharp, and then D to C sharp. And there's that screaming kind of Aeolian flavor hiding right there. I just kind of ended it like that. And then just kind of serving up that F sharp at the end. Now without, you know, changing any of the notes, let's just move that up in minor thirds. Let's do it again in A right here. Definitely catch Randy doing it there. Move it up another minor third. Now do it in C minor. Do it again, E flat. Go up again, and we're back where we started, an octave higher. You can take licks like that and start moving them around. Of course, you can start changing notes too, but right there I'm just locking into the same lick and seeing what it sounds like, you know, somewhere else on the fretboard. Or what about Van Halen's famous triplet tapping? You know, it seems like as soon as Eruption hit the scene, everybody and their grandma heard those triplet taps, and then they started tapping on the guitar. And, you know, this. Right? And they were literally tapping and then a hammer on from C sharp to E. And tapping that G sharp right there. And you could reverse the hammer on and do a pull off from E to C sharp and make a variation right there. You could start doing some of Randy Rhoads like double tapping. You can start moving around like Van Halen did in Eruption. From the variation of this Van Halen tapping, we can take the idea we used with the Randy Rhoads lick, you know, moving up 3 frets at a time or a minor third, and apply that to these Van Halen taps, and it creates a really cool variation like this. Literally right there, I'm just moving up, you know, from that original tapping area, tapping that G sharp, C sharp to E. There's the original tap, and then you're going to move up a minor third. So really what I want you to do to kind of help you see where you are, you're going to basically move the fret hand up 1 fret below where the tap is. So you're going to move your pinky up to the 8th fret right there. And then your tapping note's going to move up a minor third too. But that kind of gives you a visual to see where you are and where the tap notes and the fretted notes kind of move, like that. And then move it up. Move it up again the same way. Move this up 1 fret below where your tap note is, and then move that up a minor third. Do it again right there and right there. And then do it again right here and right there, and we're an octave higher than where we started. Really cool lick though. That's going to wrap this episode of Brewster's Millions of Rants with Passing the Torch. And really, I could have used hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of other examples and licks and phrases, chord progressions, melodies, whatever. But I just really want to kind of put this idea out there and kind of get some of the viewers out there thinking about this. Really, I guess what we're talking about is taking something that somebody else played or recorded, and then you're making modifications to it. You're changing something. You know, maybe it's the key or the phrasing, the rhythm, the contour. Like maybe, you know, when you heard it originally, maybe it moved up, and then you made a variation and started moving down with it or something like that. And there's all sorts of stuff like this. So really, there's only 12 notes in music, and until somebody invents the note H, we're stuck with the 12 notes, you know, A through G sharp. And there's millions and millions of different things you can do with those notes. But you will find phrases and ideas and inspiration coming from other musicians and other players. And maybe not even the guitar, it might be another instrument. You might hear something on a saxophone or a cello or something that inspires you. Heck, you might hear your neighbor whistling in the backyard and it might inspire a new lick or a phrase or a melody for a song or something. So you never know where inspiration is going to come from. And I feel you should be open to that inspiration and don't close yourself off. You know what I mean? Be open to it. Even if it's a style of music or a band or a guitarist that you don't like, there might be something that pops out that inspires you, catches your ear, maybe helps you think about things a different way or put things, you know, together differently on the guitar. Just some stuff to think about. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to the lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.